Today we're going to be talking all about patterns and where to find patterns and what you need to know about patterns before getting started with sewing. This series is tailored towards the absolute beginner, so I'm going to guide you through everything you need to know about patterns. So there are a few different places that you can acquire patterns. And I'm also going to mention a resource for free patterns, which I've personally used myself, and I've made projects from these free patterns. So first, the most obvious place to get patterns is at your local fabric store. And they usually carry books like Vogue, Butterick, McCall's, and a few others. These are well-known pattern companies that have been around for absolutely ages. And I have three main patterns here that are the core patterns I'm going to be working on during this sewing season. And one of them happens to be the blouse that I'm currently wearing. I just made this over the course of the weekend, and it's from an online Etsy shop. This is the Delphine blouse. And it's by Galia Couture, and she has some really beautiful selections of patterns on her Etsy shop. I was not quite sure about my sizing when it came to this particular pattern. So I made this as sort of a rough draft, and I plan on making several copies of it. And so far, I already know that it's too big for me. So I'm definitely going to have to make some adjustments and figure it out. And Etsy is one of my favorite places to get patterns because I feel like there are a lot of sort of indie pattern designers on there that really cater to specific styles of clothing that you're not necessarily going to find when you go to your fabric store and look in the Vogue and Butterick and those ones. For me, I really love the cottagecore style. If you've been on my channel and you've watched my series up to this point, you'll know that. And I have found that the types of clothing that I'm looking for specifically, I can find on Etsy, and it's pretty inexpensive. This pattern costed me about $20. And you can definitely find some really cheap patterns on Etsy. But I'm gonna warn you, I've seen some comments through Pinterest on some of these cheap patterns. If you look closely at the picture versus the pattern, they don't seem to match up. And some of those cheap patterns, from what I can collect by the comments, are AI generated patterns that people are selling for super cheap. But the quality just isn't going to be there. I would really warn you against those really cheap $2 or $3 patterns. Look for something a little bit more expensive, but you're going to have the quality, and it's a real pattern designer that put a lot of effort and work into their patterns. And quite honestly, I feel like they deserve to get paid what they're asking versus the $2 or $3 patterns that they don't really know what they're doing, and who knows if they're going to be there to help you out if you have a problem. So I feel like it's worth it to spend a little bit more money. The cost of a good Etsy pattern is going to be probably about the same as a good quality pattern that you're going to get in the store. And the reason why I really prefer Etsy patterns is because they're digital downloads, and not only do you get a full instruction book going step by step on everything that you need to know about the pattern, but the real benefit is that you can print that pattern as many times as you need to. And so I chose a size 14 for this blouse, but I can go down to a size 12 or even a size 10 and keep printing this pattern out as many times as I need to. And I feel like that's a really big advantage of a digital download versus a one-time pattern that if you cut it the wrong size, it's going to be really tricky for you to get a larger size once you've cut it too small. So I really do prefer Etsy as a resource for patterns for that reason. The next pattern that I have is a McCall's pattern. And I really liked this because this is a skirt pattern and it has some different options in terms of the length and different ruffle options, as well as non-ruffle. And this is an elastic waistband skirt, so it's very, very easy to make. And I've made elastic waistband skirts and I love them. And so I really wanted to get a pattern that I could go through with you guys. So I will be doing this pattern specifically on my channel during this series. I'll have that info down below so that if you want to join in on this specific pattern, you can go purchase it. This will definitely be my first sewing project that I share with you guys on this handmade wardrobe series, because this is a learn to sew pattern. And so they have patterns that are specifically designed towards beginners. And I did get this pattern at my local fabric store. It costed about, I think, just under $20. The advantage of buying a typical pattern like this is that you don't have to print it off. And printing a pattern off, like I was talking about with Etsy, the downside about that is that you have to piece together all the pieces of paper and tape them all together, kind of like a puzzle, and then cut out your pattern. So it's a little bit more extra work. Whereas a pattern that you buy at a fabric shop is going to come like this. It's going to be really easy for you to cut this out and get started a lot quicker than with a digital pattern. But the downside is that you only have this one copy, and if something happens to it, like a cat getting into your sewing stuff, that's happened to me. My cat got into my whole digital pattern. So I'm kind of worried about him getting into this. You only have one. So that's the downside. The upside being it's super quick and easy. And the instructions are going to be really comprehensive and easy to follow. And these are by trusted pattern companies that have been doing this for absolutely decades. So you can really trust these patterns versus possibly a creator on Etsy that you don't 100% know if you can trust or rely on their pattern. So there's a few different options here. And then another pattern source is Amazon. I actually bought this dress pattern through Amazon, and I feel like it's going to be very similar to the McCall's pattern, where it's going to be easy to cut out and it's going to have the same advantages and disadvantages. This pattern is by Style Arc, and they have a bunch of patterns on Amazon, and I really loved this dress pattern. So it was a little bit more pricey. It was around $35 for this pattern. And it's going to have the same issue where I only have one copy. So I'm going to have to take really good care of it. But I feel like the pattern is really beautiful. And going back to the fabric store option, I feel like I went over there and spent about an hour of time flipping through all of the books. And to be quite honest with you, a lot of the patterns did not appeal to me. It kind of felt like going into a department store, like a Walmart, or, you know, it had that department store feel to it where it just was kind of, there was nothing tailored towards my specific personal style that I could find. Although I did find this skirt pattern, it was really hard for me to find something in the style that I'm personally going for. And so if you have more of a mainstream style, it'll probably really work out for you. So it just depends on what you're looking for personally. So those are the main pattern sources that are really great options for you when you're getting started. And you want to look for something that's really basic and easy to assemble. And those bigger pattern companies are going to have patterns that are specifically for beginners. So I feel like that's just such a great option, whereas this dress pattern is gonna be a little bit more complicated. It's got buttonholes, so you really want to start out with a beginner pattern. Now, I also mentioned in the beginning of this video about free patterns, and I'm a big fan of my local library. It's a huge library that spans over the whole Okanagan region where I live. And there's different locations, and you can go online and order things from the whole system, and they'll actually ship them to your location. And so I have gotten a lot of sewing books over the years, and it's been a really great resource for me. One of the things that I found out through going through all of these books is that some sewing books will actually come with patterns that go with the book. And of course, you can't go and cut the patterns, and you can't keep the patterns, but they'll come with a pattern. And then what I've done in the past to use these as a resource was I just went to our local Staples, and I got some of this kind of paper, and then I was able to easily roll this over top of the pattern, and I'm able to see the lines through it. And then I drew out the whole pattern and then cut it out so that I would have the pattern. So it's a little bit of extra work, but it's a great way to get a free pattern if you're just starting out and you're looking to do this as inexpensively as possible, and you really don't want to invest a lot of money. This is a great way to do it. So when you're going to choose out a pattern, there's a few things that you really want to pay attention to. And one of them is sizing. You're going to need to know your size, and you cannot rely on your typical size that you wear when you go shopping at the clothing store, because all patterns really go by your bust, waist, and hip size. You need to know those measurements in order to pick the correct pattern for you. And sometimes you're going to find that you don't match up in the bust, waist, and hips for the sizing that is on the pattern you're looking at. And that can be really challenging and frustrating, but the truth is, if you want a pattern to fit you perfectly, most of the time you're going to have to learn how to do alterations to a pattern in order to get it to fit your size properly. And I'm going to go into some resources for that in a minute. But first, I just want to stick to the information on the patterns. So what you want to do is you want to find out your measurements, and then you want to pick a pattern that most closely resembles your body size. And for me, I have a smaller bust compared to my stomach and my hips. And so more than likely, I need to do a bust adjustment to decrease the bust size on a pattern. And that's why starting out with something really easy like an elastic waistband skirt is such a great option, because you really only need to know your waist measurement. Because it's elastic and you've got some give, it's just probably going to be the easiest pattern that you can possibly start out with. So that's why I'm going to be starting out with this pattern. One of the things you're going to want to pay attention to on the back of the pattern is it's going to give you suggested fabrics for this pattern. And those are the fabrics that the designer feels are going to work the absolute best with this pattern. And so for this one, it's cotton blends, lawn, chambray, and polished cotton. So those are the ones that are suggested for this pattern. And then it's also going to give you notions. So things that you will need likely in order to create this alongside your regular sewing equipment. So for this, it's just the elastic for the elastic waistband. So they're not including all of the pins and all of the tools that you need. They're just telling you what is needed other than that to create this pattern. So if you haven't yet watched it, I made a video all about tools and equipment. And those are the core things you're going to need in order to accomplish sewing a pattern, other than those suggested notions. Once you have your pattern, you're going to need to know some specific things about cutting out your pattern. And I'm going to show that in a separate video because there's a lot that you need to know when it comes to placing your pattern and cutting it out. And that's a whole nother subject. So I'm going to save that for another video. But I want to recommend some sewing books to you that I just think are like the holy grail of sewing information. And they happen to be vintage sewing books. Like I said, I have gotten so many sewing books from the library, and they're all modern sewing books. And none of them can even come close to the information that you're going to learn in a vintage sewing book. A vintage sewing book has absolutely everything you could ever need to know about patterns, how to alter patterns, how to sew patterns, absolutely everything. I've got these two books here. This is the Better Home and Gardens sewing book, and I'm sure they came out with several editions of this. This happens to be the 1970s edition. And this book has a whole bunch of sections in it. There's equipment, so all the equipment that you're going to need, patterns, and it's a comprehensive guide to patterns. And back in the day, they actually had a lot more sizing selections for patterns than we do now in the way of body types. They actually catered to specific body types, and they don't really do that anymore. But women used to sew a lot more back then than we do now. There's a section on alterations, and this section is going to be extremely helpful in guiding you to get that perfect fit for your body. So they go into bust adjustments and having too short of a waist, and if you need to expand the arm size for your arms. There's just absolutely everything that you need to know about alterations. And then they've got a section on assembling, interfacings, sewing tips. This is like a sewing Bible. You really would never need another sewing book other than this. Everything that you're going to learn in a vintage sewing book is absolutely going to apply to modern patterns, because patterns have not changed that much over time. They still have the same core elements. And then I also found this Singer sewing book. I paid $5 at the thrift store. And it's very similar in that it's very comprehensive, and it's going to guide you through absolutely everything that you could possibly need to know about not only sewing, but hand tailoring. And I really don't think you would ever need any other sewing books than even just one of these. And so you really just cannot beat a vintage sewing book. The newer books, most of them are going to be a short little guide on how to do things. And they're going to have a lot of pictures, and they're going to show you their fashions and their specific styles that they've created. But it's not a comprehensive sewing guide like these older ones are. And so I highly recommend, if you really want to get into sewing and you really want to learn everything, go find one of these at a thrift store or a used bookshop in your area, or you can even look online, and you can definitely find these on eBay, Amazon. They're there, but you're going to spend a little bit more money online versus if you can find one used. So one more quick tip about finding patterns is the other thing you can do is thrift a pattern. And the upside and the advantage of that is really that you can find patterns throughout the decades, and you can find some really unique patterns. I've found a lot of patterns from the 50s and 60s, and it's just really fun to see those patterns. But the downside is someone might have already cut into that pattern at a specific size. And so unless you have the skills to upsize that pattern, it might not be usable for you. And the other disadvantage is that there could be missing pieces in the pattern. So it's always worth a chance if you found it for only a couple of bucks and you bring it home. If it doesn't work out, usually it's not really a huge loss. So that's another way that you can get patterns. I really hope that the information I shared today was valuable to you, getting started on your journey with sewing. Picking out a pattern is a really fun part of this. So I really hope that this gives you a little bit more information before you go out and purchase yourself a pattern. I'm sharing episodes every Wednesday right now for my handmade wardrobe series. And this is going to continue for a little while, but it is going to be a limited series once I get busy on our farm. The core part of my channel is homemaking, food from scratch, and life on our farm. And that's every Wednesday. So I hope to see you again. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you again next week. Take care and have a wonderful day.